You're listening to Procurement 6, the weekly podcast from the team at Art of Procurement that summarizes this week in procurement in just 6 short segments.
Hi there, I'm Philip Heitzen, and today is Friday, December 2nd, 2022.
6.
As we enter December, all eyes start to look towards 2023, and we at Art of Procurement are no different. Yesterday, we formally launched our first thematic virtual event of the new year. Digital Outcomes is all about helping you translate your investments in technology into procurement-driven impact. And so on February 15th and 16th of 2023, we're bringing together a number of procurement peers and digital experts who are going to help us reach beyond the adoption of digital solutions to deliver impactful digital outcomes. And so for 2 days, we're going to focus on digital-enabled procurement contributions, such as building deep and actionable supply chain visibility, accelerating decision-making and multi-scenario analysis, eliminating friction from internal and external user experiences, and empowering the enterprise to navigate macroeconomic conditions and geopolitical threats. Like all of our digital events, registration is free of charge, and when you register, you'll receive exclusive access to all the session replays for the first 30 days following the event. To find out more, go to artofprocurement.com/outcomes23. That's artofprocurement.com/outcomes23, or click on the link on today's episode show notes.
5.
This week's podcast features Radhika Samant, the VP of Finance and Head of Global Procurement at Optimizely, and Lalitha Rajagopalan, the co-founder and Head of Strategy and Marketing at Oro Labs. Radhika and Lalitha join me to share their thoughts on the procurement X factor and why it's so critical to transformation. I asked Radhika to share what the procurement X factor is to her.
So coming into Optimizely, and first of all, when I took over the procurement function, one of the challenges that I kind of faced was this perception that procurement is just there to create barriers and delay the process. And when I looked at some of the literature that had been put out or shared out, it was a lot about, the purchase order process. You can't get your invoice paid without a PO. And if you make procurement only about that, then, there is no X factor, because you lose speed, you lose control, you lose, compliance becomes the primary, right? So that doesn't work. Looking at reinventing this, I think the X factor for procurement needs to be centered around a few different things. One, the recognition that your customer is actually responsible for revenue generation in most cases, or product, both of which influence revenue, right? So speed is of essence to them. There is no choice. They need to move fast, and we need to be empathetic to that cause, and portray and partner with them to enable that. The control and compliance pieces need to be a result of. I mean, if it's done right, then that's what's required. And when I started to think through how I wanted to solve this problem at Optimizely, I think Lalitha mentioned the people, the human beings, right? Ultimately, it's pulling those human beings together into a common framework that you can look at together and make the same decisions. I'm very convinced that a set of intelligent people, given the same set of information, will probably come to the same conclusions. And it just takes away the friction, right? So it's that marrying of process and system and people at the center of it that I think drives that X factor. And that's how that collaboration can happen. You need to get to the same goals, and it will work out.
That conversation with Radhika definitely put that to rest and shows that cost savings are not the top of most CFOs' agendas.
4.
Earlier this week, Kelly Barner and I joined Vishal Patel of iValua for a LinkedIn Live event where we all picked one theme for procurement to reflect on as we come to the end of 2022. My selection was a topic of modern slavery, and in the context of the supply chain, when someone is exploited for commercial gain in a situation they cannot leave, or it's extremely dangerous for them to attempt to do so, that's modern slavery. And so in a research study actually commissioned last year by iValua, more than half of European buyers said they don't include any language regarding responsible labour practices in their contracts. And earlier this week on Monday, Australia's Clean Energy Council reported significant modern slavery findings across the supply chain of solar panels, of batteries, and of wind turbine blades. Right now, if you are like me and you've been watching the Football World Cup in Qatar for the last week or so, where there's been countless of reports over the past few years of the conditions faced by migrant workers in building the stadiums and associated infrastructure for the event. This is a really big area of concern for procurement, and I think it's one of the areas that we really have very little insight into the modern slavery risks within our supply chains. And so that presents a dual problem for procurement. Obviously, there's the human effects of being an enabler of modern slavery, but also the reputational risks that those companies are going to suffer when modern slavery is exposed. And the one thing you can be sure of is that if there is modern slavery within your supply chain, it will get exposed at some point in the future. So definitely an area for procurement to focus on as we go into 2023.
This is Procurement 6 from Art of Procurement. To get notified every time an episode is published, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe. 3.
When should politicians get involved in a labour dispute? Well, that's a question that's being asked this week in the US as Congress looks set to act to force real companies and their workers to ratify a tentative labour agreement that had been agreed earlier in the year by union heads, but failed to be ratified by their members. President Biden called on Congress to act due to the anticipated crippling consequences of a pending rail strike across the supply chain. And anecdotally, we at Art of Procurement know of supply chain leaders who have shared with us how catastrophic this strike could be for their businesses. So while this may be avoided in this instance, an increasing number of labour disputes around the world are occurring as unions look to offset the impact of inflation for their members. This is one more challenge for procurement to overcome in 2023. As one risk subsides, another one definitely presents itself. And another illustration that proactive risk management is becoming a core driver of procurement value, potentially even more so than expense management.
2.
Earlier this week, I posted a poll on LinkedIn that drove a lot of interesting reactions. I'd read an article that suggested procurement was in part responsible for the increasing number of supplier bankruptcies based on how we negotiate with suppliers, and I'll pop a link to that article in the show notes of today's episode. The question in the poll that I asked was this: in high leverage situations, does procurement have a responsibility to protect a supplier from agreeing to a price that's unsustainable? So the results were yes, we should protect the supplier, came in at 75%, and no, it's their choice what price they should offer, and that came in at 25%. As usual, the comments were full of interesting points of discussion, and so much so that Kelly and I have recorded an entire podcast on this topic to be published on Monday. Be sure to listen in to hear the debate.
1.
Finally, as 2022 winds down, I thought I'd share our plans at Art of Procurement through the rest of the year. We'll be publishing our last regular podcast on December 16th, when Kelly presents that week's Procurement 6. However, Helen, Kelly, and I are all recording special compilation podcasts that will post on every Monday over the holiday break. Normal service will then resume on Monday, January 9th, 2023. In the meantime, we're working hard to finalise our agenda for AOP Digital Outcomes 2023 and planning for our first AOP Live webinars of the year. To keep updated on all of our events, you can always visit artofprocurement.com/calendar.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back next Friday at 6 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. If you've enjoyed this pod, help us grow and tell your peers to search for Procurement 6 wherever they get their podcasts.